Okay, we're in Romans chapter 1, starting at verse 8, and we're looking at Paul's prescription for persistent prayer. Romans 1:8. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And here we have it, the precept for persistent prayer prescribed. Later in Romans chapter 12, verse 12, he says, be steadfast in prayer. And then in Romans 15:30, he adds, strive together with me in prayers. And here in verse 9 and 10, he's telling us to be constant in prayer at all times. Now, thank God that means that you can't call on God too often. I don't know how many people that you have to go through to meet Her Majesty the Queen, but I was online this week and I found out that there are 8 steps that you have to go through after you've got in the same room as her. But all you need to do is just ring one time, and God, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, is going to give you an audience. Well, when you think of that, we can only lament how poorly we take advantage of this privilege and this duty. There's a British writer named Samuel Chadwick who had this to say about prayer. To pray as God would have us pray is the greatest achievement on earth. And I'm thinking, really, is prayer supposed to be an achievement? Such a prayer life costs. It takes time. All praying saints have spent hours every day in prayer. In these days, there is no time to prayer, but without time and a lot of it, we shall never learn to pray. And I'm sure that sentiment is repeated in pulpits all across the land. But surely this kind of an admonition is just precisely what causes people to give up praying and even attempting to pray persistently. I don't see Paul. I don't see the New Testament teaching that to be a person of prayer requires that you have a roster of athletic abilities. I don't see hour on your knees as being either normative for the believer or the precept prescribed. 1 Thessalonians 5:17, it doesn't say spend hours on your knees. It says pray without ceasing. So God's not talking here about spending hours on your knees unless he particularly calls you to do that. He's talking about constantly praying at all times while you're going about your day. Paul Azel, he even questions the sanity of setting aside, as one person had suggested, 3 hours of prayer a day to engage in prayer. And he wrote, would you really want your best friend to give you the silent treatment all day long and then talk your head off for 3 hours before going to bed? The precept is prescribed, and it's to be constantly chatting with God all day long, just like any child would with his parent. So prayer is not supposed to be a performance, it's supposed to be a privilege. Well, that's the precept prescribed. Now, look at the pattern that is given. And it's worth noting that Paul presents himself as a pattern to follow. He actually does that a lot. Look at verse 9. God, whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. In 1 Corinthians 15:16, Paul says, I urge you to imitate me. 1 Corinthians 11:1, he says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Philippians 3:17, he says, join with others in following my example. 2 Timothy 1:13, he says, what you have heard from me, keep as a pattern of sound teaching. And of course you hear all those verses and you think, well, that sounds pretty arrogant. But every godly father really should be setting a fine example for their children to follow and should be encouraging them to follow it. Now, come on, son, do as I do. In 1 Corinthians 4:15, Paul says, I became your father through the gospel, therefore I urge you to imitate me. By contrast, in Matthew 23, Jesus said, you ought to and obey the teachers of the law and the Pharisees because they sit in Moses' seat, but don't do as they do because they don't practice what they preach. And here we have Paul just simply saying, I talk to God constantly at all times. That's the pattern that you're to follow. So the pattern is given for persistent prayer, and it's because it's based upon, there's a promise guaranteed for persistent prayer. You can imagine that Paul would never have engaged in persistent prayer if he was in any doubt whatsoever that it made any difference. And where did he get this pattern from? Of course, he got it from the Lord. Luke 18:1 says, then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. And then later on in verse 7, Jesus adds, and will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. James 5:16 promises that the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. There was one preacher, Ray Zola, who told the story of an elderly lady who was asked by a young man who had completely grown weary of the Christian fight whether he ought to just give up the struggle. And Zola writes that she replied, smiling into the troubled face before her, did you ever notice that when the Lord told the discouraged fishermen to go out and cast their nets again, that it was right in the same old spot where they had been fishing all night and had caught nothing? Jesus told his disciples this parable to pray and to continue to pray and never give up. And then he goes on to say, and will not God answer that prayer who cries out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? No, he won't. So this precept is prescribed. It's persistent prayer. And the pattern is given. Paul says, just do what I do. And it's based upon this promise that's guaranteed about persistent prayer, that God answers persistent prayer. Well, let's look for a moment at some of the problems undermining persistent prayer. Why is it that we don't do it? Well, the first one, of course, is unbelief. If you look back in verse 5, he says, we receive grace and apostleship to call people from among all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. The obedience that comes from faith, meaning that a lack of faith, unbelief, is disobedience and will result in disobedience. There'll be no prayer. There'll certainly be no persistent prayer. James 1:6 says, but let a man pray in faith, nothing wavering. That means no unbelief. For let that man not think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. Well, obviously, if a person is wavering in unbelief, doubting that God really even hears prayer, they're certainly not going to pray persistently. Okay, then, how does the faith of an individual believer start to waver in unbelief? What causes that? Well, just 2 verses later, look in Romans 1:11, he says, I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. See, we're asking, what causes faith to waver? And he tells us right here, people quit the fellowship. They quit going to church to worship. And so their faith is not encouraged. And that is, of course, extremely detrimental to it. Hebrews 10:25, you know the verse, it says the same thing. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage each other. So the grand purposes for not just doing church on TV is because when you're in a church that God has established, there's an immense encouragement to your faith that occurs in the interaction of people and their testimonies and their prayer requests. Well, when faith wanes, unbelief causes you to give up. Certainly give up in prayer. Persistent in prayer you will not be. Another thing that can undermine it is, of course, delayed answers to prayer. That can cause you very rapidly to give up praying. If we don't see results, we start to think, well, Lord, what's the point of me praying? But notice Paul's faith in verse 13. I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so till now. Was he prevented because God doesn't hear prayer half the time? Was he prevented from doing so because God didn't love him anymore? Was he prevented from doing so because when he prayed, the bad outweighed the good in his life? I mean, these are all things that church members cripple themselves with. No, he says, I've been prevented from doing so, haven't had my prayers answered until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, meaning later. So listen to Paul's faith here. He keeps praying because even though God hasn't answered his prayer, by faith he saw God's going to answer it. He's fully going to answer my prayer, but only when his better timing is right. Somebody wrote, Lord, I'm so discouraged, I don't know what to do. I have so many burdens, and I gave them all to you, but you didn't take them, Jesus. Will you tell me why that should be? The answer is simply, little one, because you quit on me. So what are the problems? That's what we're talking about to persistent prayer. Why might we not be doing it? Unbelief. We weren't patient for God to answer. And then, of course, sin in the heart. Look at verse 5 and 6. Through him and for his name's sake we received grace and apostleship to call people from among all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. And then he says something interesting that connects to it. And you are also among those who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. He connects those two things. So you're called to obedience and you're called to belong to Jesus Christ. Well, if you belong more to the world than to Christ, then there's nothing but disobedience coming from your faith. You're certainly not going to be passionate about persisting in prayer. And even if you were, which you won't be, God's not going to be passionate about answering your prayer. Psalm 66, verse 17 and 18, David says, I cried out to him with my mouth, and his praise was on my tongue. But if I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. So what's undermining persistent prayer? Sin in the heart. Of course, an unforgiving attitude can do that. Look at verse 7. He says, grace and peace to you from God our Father and from our Lord Jesus Christ. As he's talking about these things, he prays grace and peace. Well, you see, if you don't receive God's grace yourself, you don't walk in God's grace yourself, you're not going to have any to give to other people. Certainly won't have enough to overflow into the lives of other people. And if you're not giving grace to other people, what happens? Well, in Mark 11:25, Jesus said, when you stand praying, forgive if you have aught against anyone. Make sure that you're giving grace to those in your life who need it from you. You know, before we pray, it's rather worthwhile knowing that if we haven't forgiven anybody, it's going to shut down your communion with God, just like that. So it's unbelief, you've got impatience, you've got sin in the heart, an unforgiving attitude, to be specific. How about not protecting those around you? Certainly not protecting those in your life who you should be protecting. That'll mess with your prayer life. 1 Peter 3:7 says, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner, speaking of them being weaker physically in most cases, and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Marvelous verse where God says, men, if you don't protect your wives, if you don't treat them as complete equals, no reason why God should listen to a word you have to say. So there's this pattern that's given. There's this promise that is guaranteed. There's these problems regarding. And now let's look at the person required. Who's going to be this person who will engage in persistent prayer? What kind of person is that? Well, first of all, it's a person who sees themselves as a servant. Look at verse 9. God, whom I serve with my whole heart in preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in prayers at all times. So Paul prayed constantly because he saw himself as going throughout his day serving God's purposes. Prayer to him was serving God's purposes. Now, if you only pray to serve your own purposes, guess what? You're only going to pray when you got a problem with your purposes. So you've got to see yourself all day long as not serving yourself, but God. So many verses for that. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Ephesians 6:7, serve others wholeheartedly, but as though you were serving God. You're really only ever serving God. You're praying, you're serving God. The believer is primarily a servant of God. The unbeliever rejects God. You know why? Primarily because he doesn't want to serve God. Not really because he doesn't believe there's a God. He doesn't want to serve him. What does the unbeliever say? In Job 21:15, they say, who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him? There's a connection there. So the person required for persistent prayer, the person who's going to do it, has got a heart of a servant. And secondly, they have a heart of thankfulness. Verse 8, first I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. Wow. Notice that a heart of thankfulness for the people of faith in his life, that God had brought into his life. There's a question we could ask ourselves. Are we truly thankful for the people of faith that God has surrounded us with and put in our lives? I want to give you an illustration I've given you before, but it really just drives this thing home. In 1773, John Fawcett was the pastor of a very small, poor church in a place called Wainsgate in England. And he was called to pastor a very large and influential church in London. And the call was inevitable because he was such a powerful preacher, such a wonderful teacher, and also a very good writer. But as the wagons were being loaded with the Fawcett's very few belongings, the people of the congregation all came out to bid them a sort of tearful farewell. And during the goodbyes, Mary Fawcett turned to her husband in tears and said, John, I can't bear to leave these people. Neither can I, he replied. So we shall remain here with our people. And the wagons were unloaded, and John Fawcett and his wife spent the 54 years left of their life ministering in Wainsgate. And because of that experience, Fawcett wrote that beautiful hymn that we really need to sing here someday, and that is, blessed be the tie that binds. The more you're thankful for the other believers that God has brought into your life, the more they encourage you, the more you encourage them, the more you'll find yourself praying. So there's this pattern given, a promise guaranteed, some problems regarding. We looked at the person who's going to be doing it, and now let's look at the process practiced, because he says, I constantly remember you in my prayers at all times. Well, how do you do that? Do you have some tips on how I can be more persistent in prayer? Sure. Let's look not at the life of Paul, but the life of Jesus. He prayed early in the morning. Mark 1:35, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and left the house and went to a solitary place and prayed. So he prayed early in the morning. He also prayed before important decisions. The whole future of the Christian church rested upon Jesus' choice of those first disciples. And in Luke 6:12-13, we read that he went out to a mountain to pray, and he prayed all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called to his disciples, and he chose from them 12 whom he named apostles. So he would pray early in the morning. He would pray before making difficult decisions. He would pray when he was under pressure. Hebrews 5:7, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. It's interesting that the more pressure that Jesus was under, the more he resorted to prayer. It's kind of the opposite of us. We tend to pray less as things get more busy and hectic. Taylor Smith said, beware of the barrenness of busyness. He prayed under pressure, and he prayed when he had concerns for others. In Luke 22:31, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail. And of course, he tells us to pray when we're tempted. Watch and pray that you fall not into temptation. Luke 18:1, Jesus taught this parable to show that his disciples should always pray and not give up. You've heard of the proverbial busy bee. Well, the reasons that was given to bees is because they're extraordinarily busy. I was reading online that it takes a total of 3,360,000 visits to clover heads in order to produce 1 pound of honey. So maybe we just have to make a lot more trips to the clover head in order to be rewarded. And that's Paul's prescription for persistent prayer. You can do it all through the day, and it can be a privilege. It doesn't have to be a horrible grinding performance. Let's pray.